law. Striking laborers were also arrested on the charge of vagrancy because they were supposed to be working, I assume. It was only when the United States federal court assumed jurisdiction in these cases that Peabody, probably knowing that he would lose, ordered the men released. The Union workers, though, were not just fighting against outside forces like mine owners, the military, and Governor Peabody. They also had to contend with secret agents within their own ranks working against them. These agents were employed by none other than the Pinkerton Detective Agency and the head of the Denver office, James McParland of Molly Maguire fame. There were at least two agents, Operative Smith and Strong, who had prime positions within the Union. Smith in particular had the trust of the leadership, so the mine owners knew everything the Union was planning days in advance. He was especially useful in letting them know where and when the Union organizers would be traveling and thus were vulnerable. In one case, Union leaders were only on the road for 1.5 miles when 8 masked men stopped their wagon. They were held up with revolvers and thrown to the ground where the masked men beat and kicked them almost unconscious. Then in another case, a national organizer for the United Mine Workers was on a train when 3 men assaulted and knocked him out. These men and others like them were found and assaulted thanks to the work of these brave Pinkerton spies. It wasn't just in Colorado that the Pinkertons plied their trade either. Wherever laborers were fighting for such radical things as an 8-hour workday, being paid in actual money instead of company scrip, and safer working conditions, as their bosses were more concerned about profits than their employees, the Pinkertons wouldn't be far away. Take Wyoming, for example. Thanks to the Pinkerton spies, Union organizers who were trying to unite the workers there couldn't even hold a meeting without the mine bosses showing up and disrupting it. The arrival of the bosses caused many of the workers to flee from said meetings, not wanting to get caught being sympathetic toward unionizing. It was constant. No matter what the union organizers tried, no matter how secretive they thought they were being, every time they tried to hold a meeting as if by clockwork, like they had been personally invited, the mine bosses would walk in. Numerous times the organizers thought they were numerous times the organizers, thinking they were being clever, held a meeting after midnight with a select few invited, and still, with the meeting barely started, in walked a mine supervisor. This happened at least 24 times, frustrating the union organizers who had never seen anything like this. Back in Colorado on Monday, June 6, 1904, a real tragedy actually happened, when between 13 and 15 miners were instantly killed when a dynamite explosion blew up the Florence and Cripple Creek train at the station. The WFM were naturally blamed, and with the help of General Bell and others sympathetic to the mine owners, dozens of Union members and sympathizers were rounded up. A military commission on deportation was then set up to decide the fate of those now being held in the bullpens. Hundreds were subsequently found guilty and sent on trains out of Colorado. While the Union was obviously accused of this act, it doesn't make a lot of sense that they were the ones actually responsible. The area in question, you see, was heavily guarded, and Union members were under heavy surveillance by the military forces, mine-owned detectives, and Pinkerton agents, so the chance that one of them managed to slip through this web seems slim. Plus, the Union would also have known that such an act would have accomplished nothing for their cause, other than to turn public sentiment against them. So, while sure it's possible that a striking worker was responsible, it's still extremely unlikely. It also seems questionable that the military and mine owners even believed that the Union men were responsible, because if they did, why were they deporting them instead of holding them for trial and punishment? Regardless, this would spell the end of the WFM in Cripple Creek. Still, the Western Federation of Miners, despite this setback, represented a dangerous foe for greedy mine owners looking to exploit their workers. However, the events of the 30th of December 1905 would provide yet another opportunity to put an end to the WFM once and for all, when an explosion killed the former Idaho governor Frank Steunenberg when he opened the gate to his property. You see, for some time now, James McParland, just like he had in Pennsylvania, had been telling the mill and mine owners that the Western Federation of Miners, just like the AOH, had a dangerous inner circle of radicals like the Molly Maguires, and they were the ones actually behind every misdeed in the region. This explosion then was McParland's chance to prove it and put an end to the WFM once and for all. Indeed, McParland quickly caught the evildoer one Harry Orchard, who, under the famous Pinkerton detective supervision, not only confessed to the bombing that killed the former Idaho governor, but also admitted to being responsible for numerous other dangerous and/or deadly explosions, all at the order of WFM leadership. What was strange about this is despite having multiple well-placed secret operatives within the Union, none of them had ever returned a report on any meetings or discussions among the leadership about killing anyone or blowing anything up. Stuff that you would think a group like the Pinkertons, who were actively looking to take down the Union, would have taken special note of. What we're expected to believe here then is that McParland was a kind of super agent. It had taken him 3 years to uncover the dastardly Molly Maguires, who we now question whether or not they really existed, and now he only needed all of 6 weeks to uncover what he himself would describe as a far more dangerous, far-reaching, and dastardly conspiracy. And doing so despite none of the Pinkerton's well-placed agents beforehand producing the slightest bit of evidence of this evil inner circle and their terroristic plannings. The problem for McParland, though, was Orchard was not the most trustworthy of witnesses. To begin with, he had multiple wives at the same time, and a long trail of lies and fraud in his past. Plus, Orchard would later admit that he had worked for the two genius detectives Scott and Sterling, who had attempted to fake derail a train and blame it on the Union. So McParland knew he needed a corroborating confession, and that's where Stephen Adams came in, as Adams also confessed to the crime implicating the Western Federation miners' leadership as well. The case seemed cut and dry. The WFM was just a bunch of crazed radicals bent on murder and overthrowing the established order. Everything as far as the Pinkertons were concerned seemed to be coming together perfectly. Then prize witness Stephen Adams' wife Annie managed to meet her husband in jail. Following this meeting, Annie was able to sneak out this witness statement that read, quote, "This is to certify that the statement that I signed was made up by James McParland detective and Harry Orchard alias Tom Hogan. I signed it because I was threatened by Governor Gooding, saying that I would be hanged if I did not corroborate Orchard's story against the officers of the Federation Union of Miners." So McParland had forced Stephen Adams to confess, and he had likely done the same with Orchard so he would confess that he was working for the Western Federation of Miners. Now, Harry Orchard would still be found guilty, and he likely had actually committed the murder, just for his own selfish reasons. After all, when the local police had searched the master criminal's room, a room he had continued to stay in even after the bomb went off, they had found bits of plaster of Paris that had been present in the explosive device responsible for the former governor's death, in addition to a length of fishing line identical to the one that connected the gate to the bomb, and even more damning, the cops had also found crumbs of dynamite in the room, a set of burglar's tools, and a large quantity of explosives in his trunk. While Orchard would still be convicted, the 3 accused WFM leaders, though, were found not guilty, as no evidence was ever produced to support the story that Orchard had told at the behest of James McParland. The Pinkertons then had been exposed, but the Colorado labor wars were still finished as the Union was defeated. Workers would then continue to have to labor under such conditions and long days, or try to organize strikes on their own to improve their situation. So, Alan Pinkerton went from being a man who had to flee his home country because of his involvement in fighting for workers' rights to go on to found an agency that would become one of the strongest forces used to crush laborers fighting for the exact same things he had once fought for. As far as their betrayal and Red Dead Redemption goes, they hunted down outlaws while serving the interests of a greedy, wealthy industrialist, resorting to any means necessary. I'd say then that their depiction is pretty spot on, to be honest with you. As for everything else discussed today, company towns as they existed would come to an end in the 1920s, thanks to the spread and availability of automobiles. This increased means of transportation by the masses effectively put an end to company towns, as workers were no longer confined to just one town. Meanwhile, it wouldn't be until 1938, with the creation of the Fair Labor Standards Act, that the federal government, under the leadership of FDR, looked to, quote, put a ceiling over hours and a floor under wages, as they, by 1945, established a maximum 40-hour work week and a minimum wage of 40 cents an hour, while also prohibiting most child labor. The Act's objective was summarized as the, quote, elimination of labor standards detrimental to the maintenance of the minimum standards of living necessary for health, efficiency, and well-being of workers. The thing is, more and more it feels like things haven't changed much, if at all, from the bad old days. In fact, it often feels like we're moving backwards. For example, payday lenders are trapping people into the same debt cycle that company stores used to. Meanwhile, Google and Facebook are providing homes and transportation to their workers, suggesting that maybe factory towns aren't as dead as we thought. But even if the historical version of the company town is dead, you can look at the Nissan plant in Canton, Mississippi as an example of the dangers of a one-company town that still very much exists. Nissan, a $41 billion company who as of 2018 employed half of the residents of Canton, would in 2017, when its workers were set to vote on whether to unionize or not, suggested that if they did, the company would be forced to leave. This terrified the local political leaders, churches, and workers' neighbors. Plus, Nissan flooded the local stations with ads suggesting how bad things were before they had arrived and how much they had improved since. So, of course, the vote failed. You can see then why these one-company towns are a sound strategy to prevent unionizing. Now, multiple businesses in the same industry working near each other can be beneficial as well, seeing as how the local economy in the form of parts suppliers and other complementary businesses can be tailored to fit their combined needs. Such a setup worked for the car manufacturers in Detroit. The thing was, it also allowed the Chrysler, Ford, and GM workers to build a sense of solidarity that was essential in unionizing the auto industry. Which is why new auto factories are no longer being built near Detroit or even near each other. It's a calculated plan by these corporations to prevent unionizing by isolating their workers just like mine owners used to do in company towns. As for my reference at the top of this latest recording of current news making the story more relevant, in addition to the writers and actors strike following the blatantly villainous statement about wanting to force people from their homes, coffee giant Starbucks is also in the middle of a labor dispute. Now, while the Onion story about them hiring the Pinkertons to deal with their workers is obviously fake, there is actually a bit of a grain of truth there in that while they haven't hired the agency itself, Starbucks did hire Amanda Stanfel, a former CIA agent who had most recently been employed by the Pinkertons, a move that does not feel coincidental considering their ongoing fight against their own workers. Meanwhile, in 2020, it was revealed that Amazon had actually hired the Pinkertons to spy on their warehouse workers in Europe, with the Pinkertons reporting on any labor organizing efforts, telling the bosses the dates and times of meetings and who was involved. In other words, it sounds like they haven't changed at all. Also sadly relevant today is something that I had actually thought they wouldn't try to bring back, but that was just me giving people more credit than they deserve apparently. I thought the very idea of advocating for the return of child labor would be a bridge too far even for the worst schools of today, but I was apparently wrong. Now, our child labor laws were never foolproof by a long shot. Indeed, we've never had a really clear picture on how bad the issue continued to be, since businesses definitely weren't going to report it, while the parents of the children would also want to keep things quiet, because more than likely they were in a position where they needed that paycheck from their kids to get by, and the government itself wasn't really all that interested in reporting on child labor violations because it makes them look bad for allowing it to happen in the first place. Plus, our laws notably didn't even include the agricultural sector at all. Yet, even with that, there were at least some protections limiting or preventing child labor in the US. In recent years, though, 14 states across the US have been actively trying to roll back child labor protections, as companies across multiple industries, just like they did back in the Gilded Age, were looking to take advantage of that sweet, cheap child labor. In some states, the laws have just been proposed, while in others, the laws rolling back these protections have already passed. And while a lot of these efforts seem to be targeted at the state level, the lumber industry in particular has been pushing for a bill in the US House and Senate. Indeed, this push for more child labor is already having an effect, as from 2015 to 2022, the number of kids working in the US rose 37%, a number that's only likely to grow. For example, 12-year-olds in Florida can now work as roofers. 14-year-olds in Iowa can now work night shifts and be employed in industrial laundries, while at 15 they start work on assembly lines, and at 16 they can work in construction, excavation, and demolition, all the while working powerful machinery. And to be clear, this is just what they're doing legally, thanks to their campaign against laws preventing child labor, as this doesn't include the 13-year-olds found working in meatpacking plants and slaughterhouses in places like Minnesota and Nebraska for companies like Tyson Foods, while in Alabama, kids have been found working in places supplying Hyundai and Kia. And to be clear, I'm well aware of how major companies have been using child labor in other countries all this time, so I'm not surprised that they're still interested in using it, just I had a feeling that part of the reason why they were only doing so in other countries was because they feared the backlash at home should they try to do it here. Meanwhile, if you were paying attention to this episode, knew anything about why child labor was banned in the first place, or have what I'd like to call a brain, you won't be surprised to learn that places looking to hire children aren't safe for, children, as accident rates among child laborers is alarmingly high, as they suffer from a list of incidents that result in things like poisonings, disfiguring burns, amputations, and even shattered spines. Now, ghouls like Senator Jim Risk of Ohio have defended the legislation being pushed by the lumber industry by saying that it only allows the teens to work in logging under a parent's supervision, as if such a rule would actually be observed or even enforced. Yet, even if such a rule were enforced, Wendy Bostwick calls such a law, quote, bullshit, because her 18-year-old son Cole died in 2014 while working at the same logging site his father Tim was working on. In response to the proposed law, Wendy would say that logging was, quote, one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, and people want to put their kids out there? Kids that age are not emotionally ready for something like this. They don't have the mental faculties to drink alcohol, but they can go out there and make life and death decisions? I don't think so. It's dumb and dangerous. Indeed, just a couple weeks ago, in the first week of July in northern Wisconsin,